Do you think experts can save us? Is there such thing as expertise and experts in something? How do you know if you've
Yeah.
achieved it?
I think it's important to acknowledge up front that there's something paradoxical about how we relate to authority, especially within science. And I don't think that paradox is going away. And it doesn't have to be confusing. And it's not truly a paradox. It's just like there are different moments in time. So it is true to say that within science or within rationality generally, I mean, just whenever you're having a fact-based discussion
Mhm.
about anything, it is true to say that the truth or falsity of a statement does not even slightly depend on the credentials of the person making the statement, right? So it doesn't matter if you're a Nobel laureate, you can be wrong, right? The last sentence you spoke could be total bullshit, right? And it's also possible for someone who's deeply uninformed to be right about something, or to be right for the wrong reasons, right? Or someone just gets lucky, or someone, and there are middling cases where you have like a backyard astronomer who's got no credentials, but he just loves astronomy and he's got a telescope and he spends a lot of time looking at the night sky, and he discovers a comet that no one else has seen. Not even the professional expert astronomers. Um, I mean, I got to think that happens less and less now, but some version of that keeps happening, and it may always keep happening in every area of expertise, right? Um, so it's true that truth is orthogonal to the reputational concerns we have among apes who are talking about the truth. Um, but it is also true that most of the time, real experts are much more reliable than frauds or people who are not experts, right? And expertise really is a thing, right? And when you're flying an airplane in a storm, you don't want just randos come into the cockpit saying, "Listen, I've got a new idea about how we should tweak these controls," right? You want someone who's a trained pilot, and that training gave them something, right? It gave them a set of competences and intuitions, and they know what all those dials and switches do, right? And I don't, right? I shouldn't be flying that plane. Um, so when things really matter, and putting this at 30,000 feet in a storm sharpens this up. We want real experts to be in charge, right? And we are at 30,000 feet a lot of the time on a lot of issues, right? And whether they're public health issues, whether it's a geopolitical emergency like Ukraine, climate change. I mean, just pick your topic. There are real problems, and the clock is rather often ticking, and their solutions are non-obvious, right? And so expertise is a thing, and deferring to experts much of the time makes a lot of sense. It's at minimum it prevents spectacular errors of incompetence and uh, just foolhardiness. But even in the case of some where you're talking about someone, I mean, people like ourselves who are like, we're well educated, we're not the worst possible candidates for the Dunning-Kruger effect. When we're going into a new area where we're not experts, we're fairly alert to the possibility that we don't, it's not as simple as things seem at first, and we don't know how our tools translate to this new area. We can be fairly circumspect, but we're also, because we're well educated, we can we're pretty quick studies. We can learn a lot of things pretty fast, and we can begin to play a language game that sounds fairly expert, right? And in that case, the invitation to do your own research, right, is in when times are good, I view as an invitation to waste your time pointlessly,
Mhm.
right? When times are good. Now, the truth is times are not all that good, right? And we have the ongoing public display of failures of expertise. We have experts who are obviously corrupted by bad incentives. We've got experts who perversely won't admit they were wrong when they, in fact, are demonstrated to be wrong. We've got institutions that have been captured by political ideology that's not truth tracking. I mean, this whole woke uh, encroachment into really every place, whether it's universities or science journals or government, or I mean, it's just like that has been genuinely deranging. Um, so there's a lot going on that where experts and the very concept of expertise has seemed to discredit itself. But the reality is that there is a massive difference when anything matters, when there's anything to know about anything. There is a massive difference most of the time between someone who has really done the work to understand that domain and someone who hasn't. And if I get sick or someone close to me gets sick, I have a PhD in neuroscience, right? So I can read a medical journal article and understand a lot of it, right? And so I'm just fairly conversant with medical terminology. And I understand its methods, and I'm alert to the difference because because in neuroscience I've spent hours and hours in journal clubs, diagnosing, and analyzing the difference between good and bad studies. I'm alert to the difference between good and bad studies in medical journals, right? And I understand that bad studies can get published, and et cetera, and experiments can be poorly designed. I'm alert to all of those things, but when I get sick or when someone close to me gets sick, I don't pretend to be a doctor, right? I've got no clinical experience. I don't go down the rabbit hole on Google for days at a stretch trying to become a doctor, much less a specialist in the domain of problem that has been visited upon me or my family, right? So if someone close to me gets cancer, I don't pretend to be an oncologist. I don't go out and I don't start reading, in journals of oncology and try to really get up to speed as an oncologist, because it's one is a bad and potential and very likely misleading use of my time, right? And it's if I had a lot of runway, if I decided, okay, it's really important for me to know everything I can at this point. I know someone's going to get cancer. I may not go back to school and become an oncologist, but what I want to do is I want to know everything I can know about cancer, right? So I'm going to take the next 4 years and spend most of my time on cancer. Okay, I could do that, right? I still think that's a waste of my time.
Mhm.
I still think even at the end of those 4 years, I'm not going to be the best person to form intuitions about what to do in the face of the next cancer that I have to confront. Um, I'm still going to want a better oncologist than I've become to tell me what he or she would do if they were in my shoes or in the shoes of my family member. I'm going to I'm not advocating a blind trust in authority. Like if you get cancer and you're talking to one oncologist and they're recommending some course of treatment, by all means get a second opinion, get a third opinion, right? But it matters that those opinions are coming from real experts and not from, you know, Robert Kennedy Jr., who's telling you that, you got it because you got a vaccine, right? It's like, it's just, we're swimming in a sea of misinformation where you've got people who are moving the opinions of millions of others who should not have an opinion on these topics. Like there is no scenario in which you should be getting your opinion about vaccine safety or climate change or the war in Ukraine or anything else that we might want to talk about from Candace Owens, right? It's just she's not a relevant expert on any of those topics, and what's more, she doesn't seem to care, right? And she's living in a culture that has amplified that not caring into a business model, and an effective business model, right? So and that, there's something very Trumpian about all that. Or like that's the problem is the culture. It's not these specific individuals. So the paradox here is that expertise is a real thing, and we defer to it a lot as a labor saving device, and it's just based on the reality that it's very hard to be a polymath, right? And specialization is a thing, right? And so there are people who specialize in a very narrow topic. They know more about that topic than the next guy, no matter how smart that guy or gal is. Uh, and that those differences matter. But it's also true that when you're talking about facts, sometimes the best experts are wrong. The scientific consensus is wrong. You get a sea change in the thinking of a whole field because one person who's an outlier for whatever reason decides, okay, I'm going to prove this point, and they prove it, right? So somebody like the doctor who believed that stomach ulcers were not due to stress, but were due to H. pylori infections, right? So he just drank a vial of H. pylori bacteria and proved that, and quickly got an ulcer and convinced the field that at minimum H. pylori was involved in that process. Okay, so yes, everyone was wrong. That doesn't disprove the reality of expertise. It doesn't disprove the utility of relying on experts most of the time, especially in an emergency, especially when the clock is ticking, especially when you're in this particular cockpit and you only have one chance to land this plane, right? You want the real pilot at the controls.
But there's just a
Yeah,
few things to say.
go.
So one, you mentioned this example with cancer and doing your own research. There's several things that are different about our particular time in history. One, doing your own research has become more and more effective because you can read. The internet made information a lot more accessible, so you can read a lot of different meta-analyses. You can read blog posts that describe to you exactly the flaws in the different papers they make up the meta-analyses.
Mm.
They and you can read a lot of those blog posts that are conflicting with each other, and you can take that information in, and in a short amount of time you can start to make um, good faith interpretations. For example, I don't know, I don't want to overstate things, but if you suffer from depression, for example, then you could go to an expert and a doctor that prescribes you some medication.
Yeah.
But you could also challenge some of those ideas and seeing like what are the different medications, what are the different side effects, what are the different solutions to depression, all that kind of stuff. And I think depression is just a really difficult problem that's very I don't want to again state incorrect things, but I think it's there's a lot of variability of what depression really means. So being introspective about the type of depression you have and the different possible solutions you have, just doing your own research as a first step before approaching a doctor or as you have multiple opinions could be very beneficial in that case. Now, that's depression. That's something that's been studied for a very long time. With a new pandemic that's affecting everybody, it's with the airplane, I would equate it to like 9/11 or something. Like the new emergency just happened, and every expert in the world is publishing on it and talking about it.
Mm.
So doing your own research there could be exceptionally effective in asking questions. And then there's a difference between experts, virologists, and it's actually a good question: who is exactly the expert in a pandemic?
Yeah.
But there's the actual experts doing the research and publishing stuff. And then there's the communicators of that expertise. And the question is if the communicators are flawed to a degree where doing your own research is actually the more effective way to figure out policies and solutions, because you're not competing with the experts. You're competing with the communicators of expertise. That could be WHO, CDC in the case of the pandemic, or politicians, or political type of science figures like Anthony Fauci. There's a question there of the effectiveness of doing your research, your own research in that context, and the competing forces there, incentives that you've mentioned, is you can become quite popular by being contrarian, by saying everybody's lying to you, all the authorities are lying to you, all the institutions are lying to you.
Mm.
So those are the waters you're swimming in.
Yeah.
But I think doing your own research in that kind of context could be quite effective.
Let me be clear. I'm not saying you shouldn't do any research, right? I'm not saying that you shouldn't be informed about an issue. I'm not saying you shouldn't read articles on whatever the topic is. And yes, if I got cancer or someone close to me got cancer, I probably would read more about cancer than I've read thus far about cancer, and I've read some. Um, so I'm not making a virtue of ignorance and of blind obedience to authority. And again, I recognize that authorities can discredit themselves, or they can be wrong. They can be wrong even when there's no discredit. There's a lot we don't understand about the nature of the world. Um, but still, this vast gulf between truly informed opinion and bullshit exists. It always exists, and conspiracy thinking is rather often, most of the time, a species of bullshit, but it's not always wrong, right? There are real conspiracies, and there really are just awful corruptions of born of bad incentives within our scientific processes, within institutions. And again, we mentioned a lot of these things in passing, but what woke political ideology did to scientific communication during the pandemic was awful, and it was really corrosive of public trust, especially on the right, for understandable reasons. I mean, it was crazy, some of the things that were being said, and still is. And these cases are all different. So, like you take depression. We just don't know enough about depression for anyone to be that confident about anything, right? And there are many different modalities in which to interact with it as a problem, right? So there's yes, pharmaceuticals have whatever promise they have, but there's certainly reason to be concerned that they don't work well for everybody, and yeah, I mean it's obvious they don't work well for everybody, but they do work for some people. Um, But again, depression is a multifactorial problem, and there are different levels at which to influence it. And there are things like meditation, there are things like just life changes, and one of the perverse things about depression is that when you're depressed, all of the things that would be good for you to do are precisely the things you don't want to do. You don't have any energy to socialize. You don't want to get things done. You don't want to exercise. You don't, and all of those things, if you got those up and running, they do make you feel better in the aggregate. But the reality is that there are clinical level depressions that are so bad that we just don't have good tools for them, and it's not enough to tell you. There's no life change someone's going to embrace that is going to be an obvious remedy for that. Um, pandemics are obviously a complicated problem, but I would consider it much simpler than depression in terms of what's on the menu to be chosen among the various choices,
Just
and
less
the
multifactorial than
logic
depression.
by which you would make those choices. Yeah, so it's like we have a virus, we have a new virus. It's some version of bad. It's human transmissible. We're still catching up. We're catching up to every aspect of
We don't
this,
know
right?
how it spreads,
We don't know how.
how effective
Well,
masks
at
are.
a certain
Yes,
point, we knew it was respiratory, but we knew,
but how
but yeah,
respiratory, what
and
that
whether it's
means,
spread by fomites, like we were confused about a lot of things, and we're still confused. It's been a moving target this whole time, and it's been changing this whole time, and our responses to it have been, we ramped up the vaccines as quickly as we could, but too quick for some, not quick enough for others. We could have done human challenge trials and got them out more quickly with better data. And I think that's something we should probably look at in the future, because that to my eye that would make ethical sense to do challenge trials. Um, but and so much of my concern about COVID, I mean, many people are confused about my concern about COVID. My concern about COVID has, for much of the time, not been narrowly focused on COVID itself and how dangerous I perceive COVID to be as a illness. Um, it has been for the longest time even more a concern about our ability to respond to a truly scary pathogen next time. Like what I for you know outside those initial months, give me the first 6 months to be quite worried about COVID and the unraveling of society.
and
But
the supply of toilet paper.
you want to secure a steady supply of toilet paper. But beyond that initial period, when we had a sense of what we were dealing with, and we had every hope that the vaccines are actually going to work, and we knew we were getting those vaccines in short order, right? Beyond that, and we had and we knew just how dangerous the illness was and how dangerous it wasn't. Um, for years now, I've just been worrying about this as a failed dress rehearsal for something much worse, right? I think what we proved to ourselves at this moment in history is that we have built informational tools that we do not know how to use, and we have made ourselves, we've basically enrolled all of human society into a psychological experiment that is deranging us and making it virtually impossible to solve coordination problems that we absolutely have to solve next time when things are worse.
Do you understand who's at fault for the way this unraveled? The way we didn't seem to have the distrust in institutions and the institution of science that grew like seemingly exponentially, or got revealed through this process. Who's at fault here, and what's the fix?
So much blame to go around, but so much of it is not a matter of bad people conspiring to do bad things. It's a matter of uh, incompetence and misaligned incentives and just ordinary, just plain vanilla dysfunction.
But my problem was that people like you, people like Brett Weinstein, people like that I look to for reasonable, difficult conversations on difficult topics, have a little bit lost their mind, became emotional and dogmatic in style of conversation, perhaps not in the depth of actual ideas, but I tweet something of that nature, not about you, but just it feels like the pandemic made people really more emotional than before. And then Kimball Musk responded, I think something I think you probably would agree with. Maybe not. I think it was the combo of Trump and the pandemic. Trump triggered the far left to be way more active than they could have been without him. And then the pandemic handed big government nanny state lefties a huge platform on a silver platter, a 1-2 punch, and here we are.
Well, I would agree with some of that. I'm not sure how much to read into the nanny state concept, but
yet, like, basically got people on the far left really activated,
yeah,
and then gave control to, I don't know if you say nanny state, but just control to government that, when executed poorly, has created a complete distrust in government.
My fear is that there was going to be that complete distrust anyway, given the nature of the information space, given the level of conspiracy thinking, given the gaming of these tools by an anti-vax cult. I mean, there really is an anti-vax cult that just ramped up its energy during this moment.
But it's a small one.
It's not to say that every concern about vaccines is a species of, it was born of misinformation or born of this cult, but there is a cult that is just, and the core of Trumpism is a cult. I mean, QAnon is a cult. And so there's a lot of lying and there's a lot of confusion. There are, it's almost impossible to exaggerate how confused some people are and how fully their lives are organized around that confusion. I mean, there are people who think that the world's being run by pedophile cannibals and that, Tom Hanks and Oprah Winfrey and Michelle Obama are among those cannibals. I mean, like, they're adjacent to the pure crazy, there's the semi-crazy, and adjacent to the semi-crazy, there's the grifting opportunist asshole. And the layers of bad faith are, hard to fully diagnose. But the problem is, all of this is getting signal boosted by an outrage machine that is preferentially spreading misinformation. It has a business model that is guaranteeing that is preferentially sharing misinformation.
Can I actually, just on a small tangent,
Yeah.
How do you defend yourself against the claim that you're a pedophile cannibal?
It's difficult.
Here's the case I would make,
Yeah.
because I don't think you can use reason. I think you have to use empathy. You have to understand.
But what, like, part of it, I mean, I find it very difficult to believe that anyone believes these things. I mean, I think that I'm sure there's some number of people who are just pretending to believe these things because it's just, again, this is sort of like the 4chanification of everything. It's just Pepe the Frog, right? Like none of this is what it seems. They're not signaling an alliance with white supremacy or neo-Nazism, but they're not doing it. Like they just don't fucking care. It's just cynicism overflowing its banks, right? It's just fun to wind up the normies, right?
Mhm.
Like look at all the normies who don't understand that a green frog is just a green frog, even when it isn't just a green frog, right? It's like it's just gumming up everyone's cognitive bandwidth with bullshit, right? I get that that's fun if you're a teenager and you just want to vandalize our noosphere, but at a certain point, we have to recognize that real questions of human welfare are in play, right? There are wars getting fought or not fought, and there's a pandemic raging, and there's medicine to take or not take. But I mean, to come back to this issue of COVID, I don't think I got so out of balance around COVID. I think people are quite confused about what I was concerned about. I mean, there was a period where I was crazy because anyone who was taking it seriously was crazy because they had no idea what was going on. And so it's like, yes, I was wiping down packages with alcohol wipes, right? Because people thought it was transmissible by touch, right? And then when we realized that was no longer the case, I stopped doing that. But so there again, it was a moving target, and a lot of things we did in hindsight around masking and school closures looked fairly dysfunctional, right,
But
and unnecessary.
I think the criticism that people would say about your talking about COVID, and maybe you can correct me, but you were skeptic, or you were against skepticism of the safety and efficacy of the vaccine. So people who get nervous about the vaccine, but don't fall into the usual anti-vax camp, which I think there was a significant
Yeah, there was.
enough number.
Oh yeah.
They're getting nervous. I mean, I, especially after the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, I too was nervous about anything where a lot of money could be made.
Mm.
And you just see how the people who are greedy, they come to the surface all of a sudden. And a lot of them that run institutions are actually really good human beings. I know a lot of them, but it's hard to know how those two combine together when there's hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars to be made. And so that skepticism, I guess the sense was that you weren't open enough to the skepticism.
I understand that people have that sense. I'll tell you how I thought about it and think about it. One, again, it was a moving target. So there was a point in the timeline where it was totally rational to expect that the vaccines were both working, but both they were reasonably safe, and that COVID was reasonably dangerous, and that the trade-off for basically everyone was it was rational to get vaccinated, given the level of testing and how many people had been vaccinated before you, given what we were seeing with COVID, right? That was a forced choice. You're eventually going to get COVID, and the question is, do you want to be vaccinated when you do, right? There was a period where that forced choice, where it was just obviously reasonable to get vaccinated, especially because there was every reason to expect that while it wasn't a perfectly sterilizing vaccine, it was going to knock down transmission a lot, and that matters. And so it wasn't just a personal choice. You were actually being a good citizen when you decided to run whatever risk you were going to run to get vaccinated, because there are people in our society who can't get vaccinated. I mean, I know people who can't take any vaccines. They're so allergic to. I mean, they in their own person seem to justify all of the fears of the anti-vax cult. I mean, it's like they're the kind of person who Robert Kennedy Jr. can point to and say, "See, vaccines will fucking kill you," right? Because of the experiences, and we're still. I know people who have kids who fit that description, right? So. We should all feel a civic responsibility to be vaccinated against egregiously awful and transmissible diseases for which we have relatively safe vaccines to keep those sorts of people safe.
And there was a period of time when it was thought that the vaccine could stop transmission.
Yes. And so again, all of this has begun to shift. I don't think it has shifted as much as Brett Weinstein thinks it's shifted. But yes, there are safety concerns around the mRNA vaccines, especially for young men. Right, as far as I know, that's the purview of the of actual heightened concern. Um, but also there's now a lot of natural immunity out there. A lot of basically everyone who's going to get vaccinated has gotten vaccinated. The virus has evolved to the point in this context where it seems less dangerous. You know, again, I don't. I'm going more on the seemings than on research that I've done at this point. But I'm certainly less worried about getting COVID. I've had it once. I've been vaccinated. I've like it's like. So you ask me now, how do I feel about getting the next booster? I don't know that I'm going to get the next booster, right? So I was somebody who was waiting in line at 4 a.m, hoping to get some overflow vaccine when it was first available. And that was at that point, given what we knew, or given what I thought I knew, based on the best sources I could consult, and based on anecdotes that were too vivid to ignore, both data and personal experience. Um, it was totally rational for me to want to get that vaccine as soon as I could. And now I think it's totally rational for me to do a different kind of cost benefit analysis and wonder, listen, do I really need to get a booster? Right? Like how many of these boosters am I going to get for the rest of my life? Really? And how safe is the mRNA vaccine for a man of my age? Right? And do I need to be worried about myocarditis for. All of that is completely rational to talk about now. My concern is that at every point along the way, I was the wrong person, and Brett Weinstein was the wrong person, and there's many other people I could add to this list to have strong opinions about any of this stuff.
I
Right?
just disagree with that. I think, yes, in theory, I agree 100%, but I feel like experts failed at communicating, not at
They
doing.
did.
And I just feel like you and Brett Weinstein actually have the tools with the internet, given the engine you have in your brain of thinking for months at a time deeply about the problems that face our world, that you actually have the tools to do pretty good thinking here. It's the problem I have with
But
experts.
there would be deference to experts and
Yes.
pseudo experts behind all of that.
Well, the papers, you would stand on the shoulders of giants, but you can surf those shoulders better than the giants
Yeah,
themselves,
but
it
I knew we
seems.
were going to disagree about that. Like I saw his podcast where he brought on these experts who had many of them had the right credentials, but for a variety of reasons, they didn't pass the smell test for me. I mean, one larger problem, and this goes back to the problem of how we rely on authority in science, is that you can always find a PhD or an MD to champion any crackpot idea, right? You could. I mean, it is amazing, but you could find PhDs and MDs who would sit up there in front of Congress and say that they thought smoking was not addictive, or that it was not harmful there was no direct link between smoking and lung cancer. You can always find those people, and you can and so, but some of the people Brett found were people who had obvious tells, to my point of view, to my eye. I mean, and I saw them on some of the same people were on Rogan's podcast, right? And um, and it's hard because if a person does have the right credentials and they're not saying something floridly mistaken, and we're talking about something where they're genuine unknowns, right? Like how much do we know about the safety of these vaccines, right? It's at that point not a whole hell of a lot. I mean, we have no long-term data on mRNA vaccines. But to confidently say that millions of people are going to die because of these vaccines, and to confidently say that ivermectin is a panacea, right? Ivermectin is the thing that prevents COVID, right?
Hmm.
There was no good reason to say either of those things at that moment. And so given that that's where Brett was, I felt like there was nothing to debate. We're both the wrong people to be getting into the weeds on this. We're both going to defer to our chosen experts. His experts look like crackpots to me, and um, or at least the ones who are most vociferous on those edgiest points. It seemed most.
And your
Yeah.
experts seem like, what is the term? Mass hysteria. I forgot the term.
It's no, but it's like with climate science. I mean, this old. It's received as a canard for in half of our society now, but the claim that 97% of climate scientists agree that human-caused climate change is a thing, right? So do you go with the 97% most of the time, or do you go with the 3% most of the time? It's obvious you go with the 97% most of the time for anything that matters. It's not to say that the 3% are always wrong. Again, there are things get overturned. And yes, as you say, I've spent much more time worrying about this on my podcast than I've spent worrying about COVID. Our institutions have lost trust for good reason, right? And it's an open question whether we can actually get things done with this level of transparency and pseudo transparency given our information ecosystems. Like, can we fight a war, really fight a war that we may have to fight, like the next Nazis? Can we fight that war when everyone with an iPhone is showing just how awful it is that little girls get blown up when we drop our bombs, right? It's like, could we as a society do what we might have to do to actually get necessary things done when we're living in this panopticon of just, everyone's a journalist, right? Everyone's a scientist, everyone's an expert, everyone's got direct contact with the facts or a semblance of the facts. I don't know.
I think yes, and I think voices like yours are exceptionally important. And I think there's certain signals you send in your ability to steel me on the other side, in your empathy, essentially. So that's the fight. That's the mechanism by which you resist the dogmatism of this binary thinking. And then, if you become a trusted person that's able to consider the other side, then people will listen to you as the aggregator, as the communicator of expertise. Because the virologists haven't been able to be good communicators. I still, to this day, don't really know what is the what am I supposed to think about the safety and efficacy of the vaccines today, as it stands today.
Right.
What are we supposed to think? What are we supposed to think about testing? What are we supposed to think about the effectiveness of masks or lockdowns? Where's the great communicators on this topic that consider all the other conspiracy theories, all the communication that's out there, and actually aggregating it together and be able to say this is actually what's most likely the truth? And also, some of that has to do with humility, epistemic humility, knowing that you can't really know for sure. Just like with depression, you can't really know for sure.
Yeah.
Where's I'm not seeing those communications being effectively done, even still today.
Well, I mean, the jury is still out on some of it. And again, it's a moving target. And some of it, I mean, it's complicated. Some of it's a self-fulfilling dynamic where, like lockdowns, in theory, a lockdown would work if we could only do it, but we can't really do it. And there's a lot of people who won't do it because they're convinced that this is the totalitarian boot, finally on the neck of the good people who are always having their interests traduced by the elites, right? So if you have enough people who think the lockdown for any reason in the face of any conceivable illness, right, is just code for the new world order coming to fuck you over and take your guns, right? Okay, you have a society that is now immune to reason, right? Because there are absolutely certain pathogens that we should lock down for next time, right? And it was completely rational in the beginning of this thing to lock down, to attempt to lock down. We never really locked down. To attempt some semblance of a lockdown just to, quote, bend the curve, to spare our healthcare system, given what we were seeing happening in Italy, right? Like, that moment was not hard to navigate, at least in my view. It was obvious at the time. In retrospect, my views on that haven't changed, except for the fact that I recognize maybe it's just impossible, given the nature of people's response to that kind of demand, right? We live in a society that's just not going to lock down.
Unless the pandemic is much more deadly.
Right. So that's a point I made, which, was maliciously clipped out from some other podcast where someone's trying to make it look like I want to see children die. Look, there's a pity more children didn't die from COVID, right? This is it's actually the same person who I mean, that's the other thing that got so poisoned here. It's like that person, this psychopath or affective psychopath who's creating these clips of me on podcasts. This second clip of me seeming to say that I wish more children died during COVID, but it was so it was so clear in context what I was saying that even the clip betrayed the context, so it didn't actually work. This psycho, and again, I don't know whether he actually is a psychopath, but he's behaving like one because of the incentives of Twitter. This is somebody who Brett signal boosted as a very reliable source of information, right? He kept retweeting this guy at me, against me, right? And this guy, at one glance, I knew how unreliable this guy was, right? But I think I'm not at all sad. One thing I think I did wrong, one thing that I do regret, one thing I have not sorted out for myself is how to navigate the professional and personal pressure that gets applied at this moment where you have a friend or an acquaintance or someone who's behaving badly in public or behaving badly, behaving in a way that you think is bad in public. And they have a public platform where they're influencing a lot of people. And you have your own public platform where you're constantly getting asked to comment on what this friend or acquaintance or colleague is doing. I haven't known what I think is ethically right about the choices that seem forced on us at moments like this. So, like, I've criticized you in public about your interview with Kanye.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in that case, I reached out to you in private first and told you exactly what I thought, and then when I was going to get asked in public or when I was touching that topic on my podcast, I more or less said the same thing that I said to you in private. Right now, that was how I navigated that moment. I did the same thing with Elon, at least at the beginning. This we have maintained good vibes, which is not what I can say about Elon. But
I don't think so. I disagree with you because good vibes in the moment. There's a deep core of good vibes that persists through time between you and Elon, and I would argue probably between some of the other folks you mentioned.
I think with Brett, I failed to reach out in private to the degree that I should have, and we never really had we had tried to set up a conversation in private that never happened, but there was some communication, but it would have been much better for me to have made more of an effort in private than I did before it spilled out into public. And I would say that's true with other people as well.
What kind of interaction in private do you think you should have with Brett? Because my case would be beforehand and now still. The case I would like, and this part of the criticism you sent my way, maybe it's useful to go to that direction. Actually, let's go to that direction because I think I disagree with your criticism as you stated publicly. But this
You're
is
talking
very,
about your interview with Kanye.
yeah. The thing you criticized me for is actually the right thing to do with Brett. Okay, you said Lex could have spoken with Kanye in such a way as to have produced a useful document. He didn't do that because he has a fairly naive philosophy about the power of love.
Mm-hmm. Let's see if you can maintain that philosophy in the presence
Let's go.
Of criticism. Yeah.
No, it's beautiful. He seemed to think that if he just got through the minefield to the end of the conversation where the two of them still were feeling good about one another and they can hug it out, that would be by definition a success. So let me make the case for this power of love philosophy, right? And first of all, I love you, Sam. You're still an inspiration and somebody I deeply admire. Okay.
Back at you.
To me, in the case of Kanye, it's not only that you get to the conversation and have hugs, it's that the display that you're willing to do that has power. So even if it doesn't end in hugging, the turning the other cheek, the act of turning the other cheek itself communicates both to Kanye later and to the rest of the world that we should have empathy and compassion towards each other. There is power to that. That maybe that is naive, but I believe in the power of that. So it's not that I'm trying to convince Kanye that some of his ideas are wrong, but I'm trying to illustrate that just the act of listening and truly trying to understand the human being, that is opens people's minds to actually questioning their own beliefs more. It takes them
Right.
out of the dogmatism, de-escalates the kind of uh, dogmatism that I've been seeing. So in that sense, I would say the power of love is is the philosophy you might apply to Brett, because the right conversation you have in private is not about, hey, listen, the experts you're talking to, they seem credentialed, but they're not actually as credentialed as they're illustrating. They're not grounding their findings in actual meta-analyses and papers and so on,
Mm.
like making a strong case. Like, what are you doing? This is going to get a lot of people in trouble. But instead, just saying, like, being a friend in the dumbest of ways, being like respectful, sending love their way, and just having a conversation outside of all of this.
Right.
Outside, like basically, so showing that like removing the emotional attachment to this debate, even though you are very emotionally attached, because in the case of COVID specifically, there is a very large number of lives at stake. But removing all of
Right.
that and remembering that you have a friendship.
Yeah. Well, so I think these are highly non-analogous cases, right? So your conversation with Kanye misfired from my point of view for a very different reason. It has to do with Kanye. I mean, so Kanye, I don't know. I've never met Kanye, so obviously I don't know him. But I think he's either obviously in the midst of a mental health crisis, or he's a colossal asshole, or both. I mean, those aren't mutually exclusive. So one of three possibilities: he's either mentally ill, he's an asshole, or he's mentally ill and an asshole.
I think all three
It
of those possibilities are possible for the both of us as well at
No,
one moment.
I would argue none of those
All
are
right,
likely for either of us. But um,
possible. But
not to say we don't have our moments, but so the reason not to talk to Kanye. So I think you should have had the conversation you had with him in private. That's great, and I have got no criticism of what you said had it been in private. In pub, I just thought you're not doing him a favor if he's mentally ill, right? If he's in the middle of a manic episode, or I'm not a clinician, but I've heard it said of him that he is bipolar. You're not doing him a favor sticking a mic in front of him and letting him go off on the Jews or anything else, right? Um, we know what he thought about the Jews. We know that there's not much illumination that's going to come from him on that topic. And if it is a symptom of his mental illness that he thinks these things, well, then you're not doing him a favor making that even more public. Um, if he's just an asshole and he's just an anti-Semite, an ordinary, garden variety anti-Semite, well, then there's also not much to say unless you're really going to dig in and kick the shit out of him in public. And I'm saying you can do that with love. I mean, that's the other thing here is that I don't agree that compassion and love always have this patient, embracing, acquiescent face, right?
yeah,
They don't always feel good to the recipient, right? There is a sort of wisdom that you can wield compassionately in moments like that, where someone's full of shit and you just make it absolutely clear to them and to your audience that they're full of shit. And there's no hatred being communicated. In fact, you could it's like, listen, I'm going to do everyone a favor right now, and just take your foot out of your mouth, um, and the truth is, I just wouldn't have aired the conversation. Like, I just don't think it was a document that had to get out there, right? I get that many people. This is not a signal you're likely to get from your audience, right? Like, I get that many people in your audience thought, "Oh my God, that's awesome! You're talking to Kanye and you're doing it in Lex style, where it's just love, and you're not treating him like a pariah." And you're holding this tension between he's this creative genius whose work we love, and yet he's having this moment that's so painful. And what a tightrope walk! And I get that maybe 90% of your audience saw it that way. They're still wrong. And I still think that was on balance not a good thing to put out into the
You
world.
don't think it opens up the mind and heart of people that listen to that? Just have it, seeing a
If it does,
person.
if it's opening up in the wrong direction where just gale force nonsense is coming in, right? I think we should have an open mind and an open heart, but there's some clear things here that we have to keep in view. One is the mental illness component is its own thing.
Yeah.
I don't pretend to understand what's going on with him. So, but insofar as that's the reason he's saying what he's saying, do not put this guy on camera and let millions
What
of
I
people
had,
see it.
sorry, on that point, real quick, I had a bunch of conversation with him offline, and I didn't get a sense of mental illness. That's why I
Right.
chose to sit down,
Okay.
and I didn't get it. I mean, mental illness is such a,
But when he
it's
shows up in a gimp hood on Alex Jones's podcast, I mean, this is either that's more, genius performance in his world, or he's
I wouldn't,
unraveling further.
I wouldn't put that under mental illness. We have to. I think there's another conversation to be had about how we treat artists
Right.
because they're weirdos. They're
Yeah.
very. I mean, we, taking taking words from Kanye as if he's like Christopher Hitchens or something like that, like very eloquent, researched, written many books on history, on politics, on geopolitics, on psychology. Kanye didn't do any of that. He's an artist just spouting off. And so there's a different style of conversation and a different way to treat the words that are
So
coming out of his
let's
mouth.
leave the mental illness aside. So if we're going to say that there's no reason to think he's mentally ill, and this is just him being creative and brilliant and opinionated, well, then that falls into the asshole bucket for me. It's like then he's someone. And honestly, the most offensive thing about him in that interview, from my point of view, is not the anti-Semitism, which we can talk about, because I think there are problems just letting him uh, spread those memes as well. But the most offensive thing is just how delusionally egocentric he is, or was coming off in that interview and in others. Like he has an estimation of himself as this omnibus genius to rival, not only to rival Shakespeare, to exceed Shakespeare. Right? I mean, it's like he is the greatest mind that has ever walked among us, and he's more or less explicit on that point. And yet he manages to talk for hours without saying anything actually interesting or insightful or factually illuminating. Right? So it's complete delusion of a very Trumpian sort. It's like when Trump says he's a genius who understands everything, but nobody takes him seriously. And one wonders whether Trump takes himself seriously. Kanye seems to believe he seems to believe his own press. He actually thinks he's just a colossus, and he may be a great musician. I'm not. It's certainly not my wheelhouse to compare him to any other musicians, but one thing that's patently obvious from your conversation is he's not who he thinks he is intellectually or ethically or in any other relevant way. And so when you couple that to the anti-Semitism he was spreading, which was genuinely noxious and ill-considered and has potential knock-on effects in the Black community. I mean, there's an ambient level of anti-Semitism in the Black community that is worth worrying about and talking about anyway. There's a bunch of guys, playing the knockout game in Brooklyn, just punching Orthodox Jews in the face. And I think letting Kanye air his anti-Semitism that publicly only raises the likelihood of that rather than diminishes it.
I don't know. So let me say just a couple of things. So one, my belief at the time was it doesn't. It decreases it. Showing
Right.
empathy while pushing back decreases the likelihood of that. It might on the surface look like it's increasing it, but that's simply because the anti-Semitism or the hatred in general is brought to the surface, and that people
Right.
talk about it. But I should also say that you're one of the only people that wrote to me privately criticizing me,
Hmm.
and like out of the people I really respect and admire, and that was really valuable. That like I had to. Painful because I had to think through it for a while.
Yeah.
It still haunts me because the other kind of criticism I got a lot of, people basically said things towards me uh, based on who I am that they hate me. Just
You mean anti-Semitic things, or
yeah,
that you?
anti-Semitic things. I just hate the word
Sure.
anti-Semitic. It's like racist.
Well, but here's the reality. So I'm someone. So I'm Jewish, although obviously not religious. Um, I have never taken. I've been a student of the Holocaust. Obviously, I know a lot about that, and there's reason to be a student of the Holocaust. But in my lifetime and in my experience, I have never taken anti-Semitism very seriously. I have not worried about it. I have not made a thing of it. I've done exactly one podcast on it. I had Barry Weiss on my podcast when her book came out. But it really is a thing, and it's something we have to keep an eye on societally because it's a unique kind of hatred, right? It's unique in that it seems it's knit together with, it's not just ordinary racism. It's knit together with lots of conspiracy theories that never seem to die out. Um, it's it can by turns equally animate the left and the right politically. I mean, what's so perverse about anti-Semitism, like look in the American context, with the far right, with white supremacists, Jews aren't considered white, so they hate us in the same spirit in which they hate black people or brown people or anyone who's not white. But on the left, Jews are considered extra white. I mean, we're the extra beneficiaries of white privilege, right? And in the black community, that is often the case, right? We're a minority that has thrived, and so it seems to stand as a counterpoint to all of the problems that other minorities suffer, in particular, African Americans in the American context. Um, and yeah, Asians are now getting a little bit of this, like the model minority issue. But Jews have had this going on for centuries and millennia, and it never seems to go away. And this is something that I've never focused on, but this has been at a slow boil for as long as we've been alive, and there's no guarantee it can't suddenly become much, much uglier than we have any reason to expect it to become, even in our society. And so um, there's kind of a special concern at moments like that where you have an immensely influential person in a community who already has a checkered history with respect to their own beliefs about the Jews and the conspiracies and all the rest. Uh, and he's just messaging, not especially fully opposed by you and anyone else who's given him the microphone at that moment to the world, and that made my spidey sense tingle.
Yeah, it's complicated. It's the stakes are very high, and as somebody that's been obviously family and also reading a lot about World War II
Yeah.
and just this whole period, it was a very difficult conversation. But I believe in the power, especially given who I am, of not always, but sometimes, often turning the other cheek.
Oh yeah, and again, things change when they're for public consumption. When
Sure.
you're it's like I mean the cut for me that has just the use case I keep stumbling upon is the kinds of things that I will say on a podcast like this, or if I'm giving a public lecture, versus the kinds of things I will say at dinner with strangers or with friends. Like if you're in an elevator, like if I'm in an elevator with strangers, I do not feel, and I hear someone say something stupid, I don't feel an intellectual responsibility to turn around in the confines of that space with them and say, listen, that thing you just said about X, Y, or Z is completely false, and here's why, right? But if somebody says it in front of me on some public dais where I'm actually talking about ideas, that's when there's a different
But
responsibility that comes online.
the
And so,
question is
yeah.
how you say it. How you say it.
Or even whether you say anything in those. I mean, there are moments. There are definitely moments to privilege civility or just to pick your battles. I mean, sometimes it's just not worth it to get into it with somebody out in real life.
I just believe in the power of empathy, both in the elevator
Mhm.
and when a bunch of people are listening. That
Yeah,
when they see you willing to consider another human being's perspective,
yeah.
it just gives more power to your words after.
Well, yeah, but until it doesn't, like if because you can
Right.
you
There's
can
a balance
extend
to it.
charity too far, right? You can like it can be absolutely obvious what someone's motives really are,
Right.
and they're dissembling about that, right? And so then you're taking at face value their representations begins to look like you're just being duped, and you're not actually doing the work of putting pressure on a bad actor. So it's and again the mental illness component here makes it very difficult to think about what you should or shouldn't have said to Kanye.